Okay, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our shiur tonight is a part 2 that relates to the topic of the Eiruv. On Shabbos, for us Torah Jews, sticking to the guidelines that we've been handed down many centuries ago is extremely important. Among the prohibitions that our tradition addresses is the prohibition to carry in a public domain or transfer from public to a private domain. And obviously that created great difficulty, especially at times when people would simply not even have their oven to get their chont within their property, and they would have to get it from an area that is rabbinically a public domain. The Eiruv, the kosher Eiruv, was a very basic need for communities. And there was a great tzorech. Tzorech is a term that is used by rabbis for assessing a need of a community. And when there is a need, you seek out leniencies. And this is always a fundamental concept, that when a leniency is not necessary, I think we would all agree we don't have to seek it. When a leniency is necessary, well, then the responsibility falls upon the rabbinic leader, for the Talmid Chacham, to do his part to be sure to find that leniency if indeed it could be found. So our discussion last week had to do with Eruvin. We introduced a few ideas. For example, the concept of a tzurat hapetach, that if you have an area that according to rabbinic law is a public domain, you could enclose it even if you don't have actual doors, but if you have the layout of an entrance, meaning you have 2 posts and even a string on top that has the appearance of a doorpost, and that is enough to enclose an area that is a rabbinic reshut harabim, public domain. We've discussed a few other issues that related to St. Louis and New York, and today we are going to talk about the city of Toronto. So number one, we are going to be mainly focusing on 2 great rabbinic figures. One has been recognized for over a century as a tremendous posek, meaning he was an authority that was turned to for guidance in halachic matters, and his opinions have been taken into consideration for over a century, indicating that he was a great Torah scholar and a posek, quoted hundreds of times in halachic literature that relates to actual questions. And we're going to have the opportunity to briefly touch upon a few of those halachic issues that the first rabbi addressed. The second rabbi was less known as a posek. You don't find him being quoted right and left as the first one, but he was recognized as a gaon, a brilliant mind, a genius, on a level that was unmatched in Canada, right? Perhaps another 1 or 2 could have reached his level in the history of Canadian Torah Jewry. So we're going to talk about a posek and a gaon, and as we study them, we can also study a little bit about the Eiruv in Toronto. You need to be a little bit familiar with the layout of Toronto. I hope you are familiar with the street called Bathurst, but there's going to be a little bit more to it, and we'll get to that soon. But let's start off with our first rabbinic authority, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Grobart, Rabbi Grobart, recognized as the Maharil Grobart. There was a time in Toronto here where there was a yeshiva, the yeshiva of the Maharil Grobart. He was a Polish Yid, He was actually sent to Siberia at some time before the Bolshevik revolution, eventually lands up in Toronto in 1920. Some give the credit to Chamer Karolnik for bringing him here. We're not going to go through a full history of Orthodoxy in Toronto, but two names that perhaps we've heard of in the past that were present in Toronto in 1920 as this great rabbinic authority arrives. One of them was Rabbi Yosef Weinreb. He has descendants here in Toronto, Rabbi Weinreb, and he was in Shomrei Shabbos. And the other one was a Rabbi Yaakov Gordon. He was a Litvish, a Volozhin Yeshiva graduate. And obviously there were some issues in town. A lot of the politics that existed at that time related to kashrut, who would give supervision, who not. But overall, we're talking about great Torah scholars that welcomed and understood that the new addition to town, the Maharil Grobart, is the greatest of all Torah scholars. And he arrives here in 1920. We've heard often about the ward. And there are two good reasons why Rabbi Grobart is a fit for Toronto. Number one, he was from Stashov. He was a Stashover. And before the Hungarians arrived, everyone was from Stashov in Toronto, more or less. It was one of those locations that brought many people and family members into Toronto. Reason number two why Rabbi Grobart was a good fit for Toronto, he was a member and a supporter of the Mizrahi movement. He was a religious Zionist. There was a split among Torah leaders in Europe. If you follow the principles of Zionism or not, should a religious Jew join on a project that is led by secular Jews? So there was the Agudas Yisrael that was overall against, and then there's the Mizrahi, which were supportive. And the Maharil Grobart was a supporter of Mizrahi, and that was a good fit for Toronto. Toronto was a very Zionistic town. I've spoken to people who's a specific fellow whose mother grew up here over 100 years ago. Zionism is very much part of the religious layout of Toronto. Obviously, things changed later on, but that's a little bit of our history. The Maharil Grobart plays a role in Eitz Chaim, Yeshiva Sharei Torah. He is well known. The Stashover Shul was on Dundas. Okay. So Stashover has its roots. The Stashov traditions have their roots in Toronto. Rabbi Grobart was known for being a fighter for the honor of Shabbos. And there are records of him standing there in Kensington Market on Shabbos itself, giving talks and lectures about Shmira Shabbos. So this is a person that had great commitment to Torah, great commitment to people. And I would just to give you a flavor of what a significant authority we are dealing with. And as mentioned, has been quoted hundreds of times by later authorities. If you go through the poskim of the 20th century, the poskim like Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and the list is quite long. They quote right and left insights and halachic guidance from She'elot V'Tshuvot Chavalim B'Ne'imim of Rabbi Grobart. And just a few briefly. Number one, in 1915, you have a new item on the shelves in your local Walmart, which didn't exist at the time, Pyrex. Pyrex is glass. Historically, we consider glass as an item that does not really absorb flavor. And therefore, post facto, if even on Pesach, if I had some chametz before Pesach in a glass, and then someone put some Pesach dika items in the glass, post facto, it is fine. Now, until 1915, the question's always related to cold items in glass. What happens with this new entity where you could go ahead and bake things in your Pyrex? So I think the first posek that addresses this issue of Pyrex and makes it clear that it is still considered glass. And therefore, post facto, even on Pesach, if someone bakes something in his oven with a chametz stick of pyrex, it is okay. Okay, we're not going to study now the laws of Pesach, but here we have it. So many halachic authorities have been discussing pyrex for the past 105 years. The first one is Rabbi Grobar, the Chavolim B'Ne'imim. Another important psak, which is again so fundamental. People have a question come Pesach regarding medicines, and they do a little bit of research and they figure out that there are starches in the medicines that actually are grain derivatives, and they are chametz. Can I eat it on Pesach? Comes the Maharil Grobart, and he says the following, that even though there is a concept called achsheve, we talked about that before Pesach, that if you take something that is made out of bread, right? So, Talmudic times, they talked about a chair that was made out of old dough. They would take dough, let it sit, it would become like a brick, and then they would use it as a little benkel, as a little seat. So obviously you're allowed to keep it on Pesach because it's not food. But the Talmud notes, even though this old hardened dough is not food, and you're allowed to keep it in your domain on Pesach, be sure not to eat it. Because by eating it, you are giving it significance. And in the words of the Talmud, you are machshivoto, achshevei. You're making it chashuv. So therefore, there were those that were concerned regarding medicines. If I eat it, right, even though it's not edible, does my eating make it significant and thus it's considered chametz? Comes the Marel Grobart and he says there is no achshevei. And there's a whole series of questions. He also related to a very difficult one, someone with mental illness that the doctor says they need to eat on Yom Kippur. He gave a heter for that. Now, we could go on with many psukim of the Maharil, but we need to get to the bottom line that relates to the Toronto Eiruv. He arrives in 1920, and he immediately starts working on putting up an Eiruv, recognizing the fact that people are caring, and therefore we as leaders of this community have a responsibility of creating the mechanism where it is acceptable to go ahead and carry. And again, this is a Polish Yid. And this is a Yid that was in touch with the great rabbis of Varsha and Krakow and understood very well that it is the responsibility of the Talmid Chacham in town to work things out regarding the Eiruv. So he gives us a description of how he's going to enclose Toronto. How is he going to enclose Toronto where the Eiruv becomes a possibility? So you remember very well from last week that when you have a slope, the term the Talmud uses it is tel hamitlaket, right? Asara tfachim be'arba amot. In other words, if within a distance of 4 amos, it goes up 10 tfachim, which is about an angle of about 24.6 degrees, that is considered enough of a slope, and you can view it as a wall, and you have enclosed an area. Okay? So with this rule of tel hamitlaket, remember these words, Rab Maharil Grobar tells us you take care of 50% of Toronto, right? 50% of Toronto, because on the east side of Toronto, you have the Don River, and leading to the river, there's a slope. On the west, you have the Humber River and the hills of High Park. To the south, you have Lake Ontario. And guess what? Into the lake, you also have, what do you have leading into the lake? A slope. And the slope itself is also tel hamitlaket. So therefore, you have already 3 sides using it. The only issue is the north. So where and how do we find an enclosure to the north? There are no walls that you could use. Slopes do not exist. So therefore, he looks at Bloor Avenue. Why Bloor? No one in 1920 was living north of Bloor. And he looks at Bloor Avenue, and what he recognizes is that you have the telegraph/electric telephone wires on the south side of Bloor. It appears to be north of the southern sidewalk. you had poles with wires on top. And for the Maharil Grobart, you have here the possibility of Surat HaPetach. Surat HaPetach. Now, to go ahead and appreciate that, we're going to have to review a few pieces of information. Okay, I hope you see this well. Picture number one is one we're going to need later, where the Talmud, when it describes an area you enclose, the Talmud tells us the following. If you have an area that is not a public domain, it either is a mavoi or a chatzer. A chatzer is an area where several houses share a common courtyard. The mavoi is an area where many courtyards share an alleyway. And we're going to get to that a little bit later, actually, in a significant discussion that relates to blur. What we're going to have to keep in mind now is the following. The Talmud in Eiruv, in page Yud Aleph, tells us that a Tzurat HaPetach works if you have two posts and a line on top, and you have several of them one next to the other. It is like a wall. So obviously, if you have on Bloor Avenue a Tzurat HaPetach, two posts, a wire on top, you have basically enclosed the northern part because you have a Tzurat HaPetach. The only problem is the Talmud itself tells us that if you put the Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad, Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad, so what you are doing here is that you bolt to the side of the posts, right? To the side of the vertical post, you both go ahead and place this one. That's a problem, okay? That's what we are being told. So the Tzurat HaPetach only works when the top post is on top of the two side posts. This is what we are told. And that created a significant issue regarding the telegraph lines. This is an issue that was already addressed in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, where great poskim were looking at telegraph lines. And the telegraph lines did have wires, but the wires were not on top, but rather attached to a small cone that came out of a protruding piece of wood. And there was a debate among authorities if this is considered a Tzurat HaPetach or not. Now, comes the Maharil Grobart, and he tells us the following. You know, if let's say you see the picture in front of you with a lot of colors, what you have here is a road, and then you have posts. The blue arrow is a post. The top of the blue arrowed post has a green arrow pointing down. If the wire would be on top of the post where the green arrow is, you would have a perfect Tzurat HaPetach. The problem is that looking at Bloor Avenue, Maharil Grobart notices that the wire is not on the blue post where the green arrow is, but rather on a post that is coming out of it, where you will see the red arrow. So would this be considered a Tzurat HaPetach? Comes Maharil Grobart and he shares with us the following, that you should know. This is indeed a valid Tzurat HaPetach. Reason being, this is viewed as an extension of the main post. I mean, when does the Talmud have a problem with the Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad? That is if you have one post and it's bolted to its side. But on the other hand, when it has an extension and the wire is on top of that extension, that is a Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad. Excuse me, that is going to be a valid Tzurat HaPetach. So let me repeat that. When you have a post, the post has a branch coming out, and the wire is on top of that branch, it is a valid Tzurat HaPetach, not one that has the issue of Tzurat HaPetach min hatzad. Okay, this is what we are told, and this is a very significant psak. You know that the issue of the Surat HaPetach is one that brought forth a tremendous amount of debate in Europe. If you do remember, we studied a few years ago the history of the machine matzah. And the machine matzah is the epicenter of the debate in the late 1850s was in Lemberg, between Reb Shlomo Kluger and Reb Yosef Shol Natanzon, the author of the Shol Umeshiv. The Shol Umeshiv, Rabbi Natanzon, who was a great Galicianer, Poisek, and Lvov / Lemberg, he noted that you should know all telegraphs are really not a problem, and all telegraph wires can be used for the Tzurat HaPetach. And he came up with an explanation that in Talmudic times, since the norm was to put the post on top, if you put it on the side, it indicates a flaw. But when it comes to the telegraph wire, due to the fact that that's the normal way of constructing it, it does not carry an issue. So he gave that heter, which many German communities followed. Other rabbis were extremely against it. So this was a very, very sensitive or debated issue already in Europe. But Mariel Grobart gave up psak for Toronto that the situation that exists on Bloor is better than the debated issue in Europe. In other words, the structure was such that it is a string, it is a wire on top. So since it is a wire on top, yes, not on the main one, but on the side one, so the Mariel Grobart gave a heter for the Tzurat HaPetach, and he notes, by the way, V'chen nahagu bevarsha. He tells us that don't think I came up with this on my own, but rather this is already a practice that you'll find in Varsha as well. Now he does add in his response on the Chavalim B'Neimim that you should know, to be a little bit more machmir, I placed 2 posts that have the height of 10 tfachim on the 2 extreme posts that were used to create the wall on Bloor. In other words, if the wall on Bloor ran, let's say for example, from Young to Bathurst, so on the post on Young, he put a small additional stand of 10 tfachim high, and so too on Bathurst. And this, for historians, is an interesting piece of information, because up until that point, when rabbis in Europe or even in North America discussed about creating an Eiruv with structures that were already present, they never ever considered adding something to that which was in existence. They don't want to mess with authorities. But here you have a situation of a rabbi putting up something, not afraid of civil authorities, and this is really the beginning of using posts and adding things. And it is quite fascinating because you have dozens upon dozens of Eruvin throughout the world where people do add things with permission, as we'll see, to hydro poles. Rabbi Grobart is first. And next time you walk on Bloor, please be mindful of the fact that such important discussions in the history of Eiruv all originate in the Halakha Bloor. You know, there's a story about Reb Chaim Brisker that when he was in yeshiva, he studied in detail the laws of treifos, of kosher and not kosher meat. And after analyzing in great depth the laws of the liver, eventually he stopped by a butcher and they showed him a liver and he said, oh, the Halakha liver, the holy liver, meaning due to the fact that he spent so many hours analyzing halachically the liver without having it in his hands, when he finally came in contact with the liver, he saw it as a holy object. So for us in Toronto, please be mindful that there were some major halachic debates that related to Bloor. Number 1, the Tzuras HaPesach. Number 2, the addition of 2 posts to avoid issues. And number three is one that is a little bit more complicated. So listen to the following. I mentioned that the Talmud talks about a chatzer and a mavoy. Chatzer, mavoy. So people lived in houses. They would want to carry from house to house or from house to courtyard. So they would do an Eiruv Chatzerot. If they would want to share things from courtyard to courtyard, they would do a shituf, another way of combining the mavoy. Chatzer, mavoy. Okay, and there are major differences between them. The most significant one relates to a breach. We are told that a mavoy, the alleyway, if let's say there's a breach in the wall, so imagine there would have been a wall here and then a breach that you could simply walk from mavoy to the public domain. A breach in the mavoy, the Talmud tells us, is quite strict, because if it is anything wider than 4 tfachim, about 12, 13 inches, it invalidates the enclosure. Okay, so a small gap in a mavoy is significant. So please remember that. Mavoy, small gap, problem. A chatzer, on the other hand, a courtyard, if let's say there would be a breach in this courtyard, even if it is a large, right, breach, up until 10 amot, which is about 5 meters, not a problem. Okay, so mavoy, small breach, problem. Chatzer, small breach, not such a problem. Now, there is a little bit of a discussion that relates to the following. When those who are studying the Daf Yomi, I've been analyzing in great depth the laws of Eiruvin. And the laws of Eiruvin tells us that you need to combine the houses. And it was done by collecting flour or bread from every single house and placing it in one of the houses. And that's how you combine all the property. Okay, so the Eiruv has to be in a bait, in a house. Now, historically, we've created an era for the whole city, right? We're all one happy courtyard, and we have matzos that bring us all together. The problem is that there was a very, very old minhag that the matzos are not placed in a house. The matzos are actually placed in a shul. This is what the Ramah tells us. Haminhag bazman hazeh. The minhag this day and age is lehaniach ha'eruv babet hakneset. V'chen nahagua kadmonim. It's a very old tradition, and this is quite surprising. Normally, or what we would expect, would be to place our communal Eiruv not in shul, but rather in one of the houses. So the Ramah tries to explain the practice that perhaps what we are doing today by enclosing our community, and what we are doing today by having bread that belongs to everyone, it's not really an Eiruv Chatzerot. It's not a combining of houses in a courtyard, but it's more like combining an alleyway, a shituf of a mavoy. That's what we are doing. And when it comes to a shituf, a combining of the mavoy, in that case, the bread does not have to be in a house. It could be in any location that is mishtamer, that people are going to watch it, that it won't get lost. So the Ramah explains the practice of placing the matzos or bread in shul by identifying our modern day Eiruvin as a shituf mavoy, but that creates a major problem. You know why? Because suddenly, even a small gap, if you're telling me it's a mavoy, so therefore even a small gap could be a problem. And this might be theoretical, but next time you're on the south side of Bloor, on the sidewalk, that sidewalk brought forth a major question for Rabbi Grobart, because on the east side and the west side, the wall that was created to the north by the electrical wires or the telegraph wires or the hydro wires, that was to the north. But there was a gap. Let's say, for example, on Young, if you are walking on Bloor towards Young, on the south side, you have a wall of a house to your right. You have to your left the hydro wires, which is a wall, but there's a gap facing east. That gap is more than 4 tfachim. It is more than 12 inches. And if you consider our cities a mavoy, you have a problem. So it says the Maharil Gruba, don't worry about it, because there's a Chatam Sofer that tells us that perhaps regarding the bread, regarding call our cities a shituf mavoy, in reality, it is an Eiruv Chatzerot, and the gap could be up until 10 amot. Maril Grobar quotes the Chassam Sofer, and he settles the issue. He settles the issue. So if you want to go ahead and be mindful of that when you are walking on the south side of Lure, remember the Maril Grobar quoting the Chatam Sofer. You know, he was in touch with the rabbis in Varsha regarding Toronto. And one of his concerns was the fact that Lake Ontario freezes, and would that nullify the slope by the lake? So he quotes the Chidush Arim, the Rebbe of Gur, when he was asked that question by someone else. He told them, listen, when it comes to Eruvin, don't pull out a magnifying glass to seek out chumrot. If the minig is to be lenient, please don't dray a cup by trying to find every chumrah. Maril Grobart quotes it, which is an interesting piece of information. Now, when Maril Grobart did a lot of research to understand and appreciate the layout of Toronto, and you have to have a little bit of Rahmanis on him. Just imagine, you come to a new land, you probably don't know a word of English. Okay, he was educated, maybe a few words, and he has to go ahead and make his way around Toronto in the winter to identify the boundaries, to assess the slopes. Nish poshet, this is not easy. And this is an intellectual rabbi, without doubt, would far more appreciate sitting at home and studying text. But he was a devoted rabbi. But he needed help. He was new. So he got help from a rabbi who was in Toronto until 1919, but he left Toronto. Perhaps he came back to assist him. So in Chavalim B'Ne'imim, let's read this carefully because I think this is interesting. In his response, he notes the following: Ube'ahava, with love. Askir, I feel it appropriate to mention. Letova, I'm going to mention in a good way. Velibracha, and a bracha. Et Harav, who is the rabbi he blesses, Rav Yudel Rosenberg. Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg, who is a rabbi in Tur Malka. Tur Malka. What's Tur Malka? So Tur Malka is mentioned in the Talmud in Gittin. There's a story there that they had traditions. But where is the modern day Tur Malka? So let's analyze the name here. Tur in Aramaic is a mountain, mount. Malka is a king, a royal individual. So it is the person, a rabbi, who is currently in Tour, Mount Montreal. Rabbi Rosenberg, Yudel Rosenberg, left to Montreal. So he, in a cute way, he presents his name as the rabbi of Tour Malka. Shetarach harbe be'inyan Eiruv bo. He put a tremendous amount of effort. Sivev imi et kol ha'ir. Rabbi Rosenberg and the Maharil Grobart walked around the whole city, eze pamim, several times, b'yimei hakor, when it was cold, and he did not have a Canada Goose coat, b'yagia rabbah, with great effort, b'chlifi michtavim rabim b'inyan, and many letters he communicated with me regarding these matters. For those who are not familiar with Yudel Rosenberg, he was a very creative individual. He was the one that published most of the stories, the well-known stories of the Golem of Prague, And he claimed that he found an old manuscript in the Imperial Library in Metz. He was a creative individual who wrote and entertained in his writing, a Torah scholar, a very fascinating individual, Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg. He was in Toronto, left to Montreal, as mentioned, but he too deserves credit for the Eiruv in Toronto, south of Bloor. A tremendous amount of credit. Zochar Latova. So these great Geonim, these great rabbis, are ones that we should appreciate. And perhaps next time that you're in, it's Roselawn, in Roselawn, you could stop by at the grave of Rabbi Grobart, passed away in 1937. I think it's Beis Mar Cheshvan, his neshama should have an aliyah from the words of Torah, and we should always be appreciative to the person who brought us the Eiruv in Eiruv with no controversy, right? I'm sure there were those who did use the Eiruv and those that did not, but there was no controversy with his Eiruv. When it came gesund, but for the years, for the decades, from 1920 until the 1980s, this is not a controversial Eiruv. Now, what you have to remember is that Toronto changed a little bit, or perhaps it changed in many ways. But what's relevant for us is the population of Toronto. Toronto is a growing city, and in 1921, it was a city of 500,000 people. Okay, 521, they say. So when you move forward a few decades, you're dealing with a city that is more than double that. And halachically, you have to be mindful of the fact that once you have a city of 1 million people and roads that have the potential of carrying 600,000 people every single day, or the potential to carry that number, you are dealing here with a city that perhaps is a Reshut Rabim, a public domain according to Torah law, and a city that is a public domain according to Torah law. All these mechanisms that we've studied, the Tzurat HaPetach, the Eiruv, that won't work. So therefore, as we enter into chapter 2 of our discussion, we have to realize that we're dealing with a little bit more of a complex city. So we're going to introduce a rabbi, which I have the privilege in this community of interacting with those who knew him very, very well. And we are talking about Rabbi Avram Aaron Price, okay, Zatzal, a Gaon, Adir, a tremendous Torah mind, a brilliant person, no question about that. Born in Stopnitz in the year 1900 in Poland. He was a Talmud of the Sachachover, and I feel funny talking about him when there are so many people that remember him, that interacted with him. Avi Sitron, for example, shared with me a lot of things over the years from Rabbi Price. And he was a Talmud, he learned by him, and he was recognized as a Torah giant. You know, just to quote Rav Herzog about Rabbi Price, that he is a person who is a baki nifla. He has tremendous knowledge, bechol chadrei HaTorah, in all fields of Torah. There is nothing he is not familiar with. And then he adds that he is a Sinai and Oker Harim. In other words, the Talmud has a discussion of what kind of authority is more needed. One who is like Sinai, meaning that the knowledge is what he is known for, or a person who is Oker Harim, that can uproot a mountain with his brilliance and sharpness. So to label someone both as Sinai and Oker Harim is considered a very great compliment. And he got it from a very special person, from Rav Herzog. So we have to realize we're not dealing here with an average Torah scholar. There are many of them. We're dealing here with Rav Price. Arrives in Toronto, if I understand correctly, in 1937. Rabbi of Chevra Shas, Yeshivas Toras Chaim, a significant influence on many here in Toronto. He was actually awarded the Rav Kook Award in 1965 for his scholarship on Sefer Chassidim. We're talking about one of the great rabbinic minds of the 20th century. Now, he was an independent thinker, as we'll see soon. He was an independent. But just to note that some of his insights are one that are, needed to address issues in the modern world. Just a short example, once we're talking about the fact that he wrote a commentary on Sefer Chassidim. Sefer Chassidim shares with us a story, a legend or a story, that Reb Sadia Gaon once interacted with a person who was depressed because there was a servant, a slave of his father, who claimed to be the true son. So the courts were dealing with the question of two individuals, each one of them claiming to be a son of a deceased person. And it obviously, if it's a fight, it's about money. And Sefer Hasidim shares with us that what Rav Saadia Goen recommended to do was la'akiz dam besefel, to get blood from the two living parties, take the bone of the deceased and put it in the blood of each. And when blood is absorbed into a bone of a deceased, it indicates a family relationship. Now, the science of that period of time aside, what Rav Price learns from it is the fact that you could use scientific methods to figure out halachic matters. In other words, yes, in general, we use two witnesses to determine facts, but two witnesses are to be mivarer, to clarify a fact. If there is something that clarifies it on its own, that is just as good as witnesses. So this is, again, a basic insight, but among the thousands upon thousands from Rav Price. I would just like to note that when I spoke to my mother about Rabbi Price, so she told me that when my grandfather, Rabbi Malevsky, would come to Toronto, either from Uruguay or from Israel for a visit, he would always make my father take him to Rav Price to go talk to him and learning, and to be mechabed a gadol b'Torah. You give kavod to a gadol b'Torah. And my grandfather was not a person that was very big on considering others a gadol b'Torah. Very, very few people got that title, but Rav Price did, and it says a lot. Now, Rav Price was, and before we get to the Eiruv issue, you have to understand, unique. This is something his Talmidim would tell you. He was financially independent, which indicates that he had abilities that went beyond traditional text. He was a well-connected Polish authority, meaning he knew everyone from the Polish scholars, but also at the same time, this is something I've heard from several reliable sources, that perhaps there was a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, that he felt that the Litvische get a little bit more credit and honor than the Polish. And this was something that was shared with me, a unique individual that had a significant influence on Toronto. We have all benefited from teachings of Rav Gedalia Felder Zatzal. Many in this community have had the opportunity of interacting with Rabbi Felder Zatzal, Rav Gedalia. I myself love sharing the story that as an 8-year-old, I knew about the greatness of Rav Gedalia Felder. How did I know? Because as an 8-year-old child, maybe 9, but not more than that, 8 or 9, we lived in Mexico, and I went to a summer camp. It wasn't a Jewish or Orthodox summer camp that used to visit food plants in Mexico. Only in Mexico you could do it, bring a bunch of kids into a plant. And one time we left a plant, I think it was called the Marco Polo waffle wafer plant it was, and I came back with a box of these waffles that looked very, very tempting. I come home and I show it to my father and I asked him about the kosher status. He looks at the ingredients and he says, I have a question about one ingredient. However, we're traveling to Toronto. I can ask Rabbi Felder about it. So a few weeks later in Toronto, I still remember my father coming back and saying, yeah, Rabbi Felder said that the wafers are fine. So for me as an 8-year-old, I knew that's what a gadol b'Yisrael is, because I got my wafers and they are kosher. His influence in Toronto of Rabbi Price on his Talmud Muvak, Rabbi Felder, is one that says a lot about him. There were other rabbis in town, like Rabbi Albert Pappenheim. Those of you who are familiar with Toronto history will know what I'm talking about. And Soll sein gesund, Rabbi Erwin Child was a rabbi here in Toronto for many, many years, and he's still alive and well. He celebrated his 100th birthday not long ago. So Rabbi Price and Toronto are really one. Now, just to tell you about his independence and to appreciate that this is not, the run-of-the-mill type of rabbinic thinker, in his Mishnas Avram, in his responsa, he writes, he addresses a question that was a very common one in North America when people get married in a civil court and then they want to get divorced. Do they need a get? Is a civil marriage considered a halachic marriage? So many authorities say that we should be machmir and require a get. Rabbi Price noted that you should know, it appears to me that it's not just that they need a get, but Eini yodea madua lo. I don't know why not techashev. You should consider hatzara harishmi, the official declaration. Shehabal chotem etzido barchaot. In other words, that which a husband signs in court, where he commits himself to be a proper husband to his wife. In Rabbi Price's opinion, this is no less than a ketubah. And then he adds that it's very possible that that which is signed in a civil marriage is considered a kiddushin mamash. Perhaps a civil marriage, it's not just one that we should be machmer and consider it a marriage. Rabbi Price writes, maybe it's an actual marriage. Now, this is something you will not find any other halachic authority say. And believe me, he got his head eaten off by some as a result. For example, Rabbi Ben Sion Meir Uziel, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, and this is in the late 40s, he was very critical of that specific detail. And he uses harsh language, and he says to him, you should know that your psak, in my opinion, is one that is notenet yad leposhim lifnot orev likdushei yishut beIsrael al pi Torat Israel. In other words, to go ahead and write such a statement to validate a civil marriage, Rabbi Uziel tells him that it's really giving a hand to sinners. Very harsh language. And also the Tzitz Eliezer regarding this issue says to him the following, that I was disappointed in you writing it because it could be a pirza gdola. Now, the point of it is, this is not a run-of-the-mill a rabbi who thinks like everyone else, does what everyone else is doing. It's a gaon on a different level, but functions in his own way. Appreciate that piece of information as we approach the Eiruv expansion of 1950, 1951. And some people here remember it most probably. And I found actually some documents where he turns to Toronto Hydro and he mentions the fact that he has a desire to extend the boundary from Bloor Street to Wilson Avenue. And he mentions here that what he wants to do is to attach small wooden board to about 8 hydro telephone posts on Wilson Avenue. And he makes it clear that they're going to be small and not interfere in any way. So this is Rabbi Price getting involved with his Talmidim to go ahead and extend the Eiruv to Wilson Avenue. And here we have a letter back from Toronto Hydro to Rabbi Urwin Child, where he tells him, to Rabbi Shield, he tells him that, listen, you could go ahead and do so. This is the beginning of the process. Now, to the halachic world, the information about the expansion north from Bloor to Wilson is one that everyone is familiar with, because there was a rabbinic publication that every single rabbi was familiar with in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s called Hapardes. And in Hapardes of 1951, Rabbi Price writes a very lengthy explanation of the Toronto Eiruv and his attempt to expand it. And it's very detailed. I have a feeling it's one of the longest articles in Hapardes ever, maybe even the longest, who knows. And he addresses every halachic issue with gaonus, with brilliance, with knowledge of Torah. And it is one that we're going to study one of the specific details that related to the Tzurat HaPesach. Remember, when it comes to the south, it's the same Lake Ontario. When it comes to the east and the west, you have the Don River and the Humber River, and you both have slopes. When it comes to Wilson, he wants to extend it north to Wilson. You have to rely on the hydro poles. But the problem, which has been a very old one, is it a tzurat petach minatzad or not? Meaning, if the wires are precisely on top of the posts, perfect. But they are not. And this is an issue that he addresses in his lengthy article. And in the article, he shares with us that you should know, lefi da'ati, it's underlined. Lefi da'ati, in my opinion, afilu elu amachmirim betelegraph shel lifanim, even those who in the past were strict regarding the telegraph because they were concerned with the fact that the wire is not on top, when it comes to the telegraph wires or the hydro poles of Wilson Avenue, they're much better. And he uses a key word, which is lavud, lavud. Like when you have a sukkah and there's a gap between the schach and the wall, if it is less than 3 tvachim, about 9.5 inches, it's considered enclosed. It's lavud. So here we have Rabbi Price sharing the following insight. And this is quite impressive because it's a novel idea. These are the type of wires we are dealing with. So if we would go back to Wilson 1950 and we would be looking at hydro posts, it was a post. You see the post, which with these small little cones coming forth. Now, in this drawing that I made, we can explain that Rabbi Price was offering the following. True, the wires themselves are not on top of the vertical posts. However, there are several wires, and the gap between the wires are less than 9.5 inches, 3 tvachim. In halachic literature, that which is less than 3 tvachim is considered combined and enclosed. So as a result, it is as if these two wires are actually connected, okay? And by connecting these two wires, and if this whole area is connecting, that connected area is on top of this post. So you have here a Surata Petach on Wilson. That's what Rabbi Price argues in his article. As many of you know, this was something that was done. Others would go ahead and check it. They say it took a couple hours to go ahead and check it. So therefore, the expansion to Wilson Avenue was done, and he expanded it again to Steeles at some point, and eventually to Highway 7 with the high tension wires. Just one interesting and a piece of information. One of the big issues related to the 401. On the 401, you have the potential of 600,000 people traveling daily. And if the 401 is indeed a Torah, law, reshut, harabim, the Eiruv is no good. So Rabbi Price shares with us an insight that many people in Toronto have heard of, that the 401 is not a public domain. 600,000 people don't travel it. Cars travel on the 401. And cars are technically a private domain. So you don't have people. There are no 600,000 people walking the streets of the 401. Okay? And that's what he writes here, Shakvishim, it's underlined. Betoch ha'ir, all roads within a city, ein lahem din reshut harabim. They do not have the status of a public domain. Mipnei, reason being, she'eno masur, it is not given over, ela lenosim b'mechonit u'b'mechonot u'mechoniot, in other words, with vehicles. And he says that this insight is something that I found quoted in a sefer called Tuf Kuv Zayin, meaning I found this in a sefer called Taf Kuv Zayin. And Rabbi Price says, I don't know what this Taf Kuv Zayin is, but it's quoted by some rabbi who authored a work with the work with and the acronym for that work is the Taf Kuv Zayin. Rabbi Felder points out in his work that it refers to Tikvat Zecharia, authored by Rabbi Zecharia Rosenfeld from St. Louis. If you remember, we talked about him last week. Okay, now not everyone agreed with this idea that you look at a street not as a public domain for people, but rather a location where there are many private domains. Not everyone agreed with it. Ramoshe Feinstein writes on that, Lo mistaber klal. This is not logical at all. So obviously there's debate here. So Hagoyin Rabbi Price brings forth a few leniencies, the old Polish way of addressing the question of an Eiruv. He brings forth the leniency of the Tzurat HaPetach of Wilson. He brings forth the leniency of the cars, but that's what a great rabbi does, especially if he's following the Polish tradition. Toronto had an Eiruv, something we all know. Now, I mentioned the fact that it was extended to Thornhill, to the high tension electrical wires. And as mentioned earlier as well, Toronto was blessed with no controversy at all regarding its Eiruv until the 1980s. Now, I wasn't here in the 1980s, but many of you were. And from my understanding, this was not a pleasant situation, and it was not done with great wisdom. And it works as follows. A rabbi has the right to believe that he is not going to use the Eiruv. You have every right not to use the Eiruv, right? You have the right not to eat specific shechita. You could eat whatever you want, right? You could make your choice. A rabbi does not have the right to go ahead and without seichel declare that an Eiruv in town that is based on halacha, that was established by a halachic authority, is no good. That you don't do if you have seichel. Not everyone has, obviously. You don't do that. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of lack of seichel that occurs here in Toronto. And I have no problem with great Torah scholars having an issue with the Eiruv. You have the right to study. You have the right to debate. You have the right to go ahead and question and privately have a conversation with the Rav HaMachshir, but no public declarations. Unacceptable, but it appears that it was not the case. 1987, CJN, Olav Shalom, and this is one of the many articles. Rabbi Price defends validity of Toronto Eiruv. And there's a long article here that you could go ahead and want to read or perhaps not want to read. And just to quote one statement from the rabbis south of Lawrence, and they note that our notice was not meant as an insult to Rabbi Price, the spokesman said. The text that the Eiruv is no good may have come across a little too tough. I'm sure many who objected would have been satisfied with a softer tone. Okay, so just a little bit of their words regarding the issue itself. It's important, obviously, to have seichel, okay? And I feel bad for the rabbi. I read this article, and you realize how rabbis like Rabbi Lowy and Rabbi David Shaichet, they had to dance around this complex issue. But bottom line is, there was a Rav that gave a hashgacha on an Eiruv, and as that rabbi was alive, you had an Eiruv. You do not make a public declaration. You want to go ahead and talk to him, you have every single right. You want to go ahead and have a halachic discussion, you have every single right. But you got to do things with seichel. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't questions that they needed to address. There was a debate, and I spoke to a specific rabbi that noted that perhaps some of the slopes by the Don River were not the precise needed dimension for the Tela Mislaket. Perhaps, and the idea of Rabbi Price would probably tell you that we don't find that you have to measure it. Some Sofer himself says you don't have to measure it. You could do Re'ot Einayim. You could look and determine it. I'm not going to get into those specific details themselves, but what I could tell you, and this is something that will be halacha l'maisa, an Eiruv needs a Rav HaMachshir. An Eiruv needs a Rav HaMachshir. Toronto was blessed until 1994 to have Hagon Rav Price. He was a Rav HaMachshir, and therefore everyone had the right to rely on him. No question about it. After Rabbi Price's passing, Rabbi Price's Eiruv did not have a Rav HaMachshir. And therefore, nowadays, the Eiruv in Toronto is the new Eiruv, which we are familiar with, showed up in the mid-90s. It is an Eiruv that is a very fascinating one because it came, one of the few Eiruvin in the history that came from a Chumrah school, meaning they seeked out many Chumras, and it's a very high standard Eiruv. So even the Machmirim among you could feel comfortable with it. But that Eiruv has a Rav HaMachshir. The new Eiruv has a Rav HaMachshir. The old Eiruv had a Rav HaMachshir. Currently not. So therefore, one of my close friends mentioned the fact that about 18 years ago, when the Pope was visiting Toronto, the new Eiruv was damaged and there was a declaration that the Eiruv is down. Fine. In my opinion, when the new Eiruv that has a Rav HaMachshir is down, don't rely on an Eiruv that does not have a Rav HaMachshir. In other words, yes, Rabbi Price was a Gaon and Rabbi Price gave his approval, but the reality is that if it's not monitored by a halachic authority, it shouldn't be used. Things change, right? There's construction done in Toronto. I don't know if what's taking place throughout the many, many kilometers by the Don River or by the Humber River, I don't know, right? If there would be a Rav HaMachshir that really continued assessing everything Rabbi Price did, it would be a different picture. But I'm not familiar, I haven't heard that that's the case. That's a halachic piece of information. The debate was interesting. I think there's obviously much more. As I started reading up more and more about it, I realized how little I know and how much more I could study about Rabbi Grobart and about Rabbi Price, due to the fact that he was, as they say, Gaon B'Doro, meaning a unique rabbi. A lot more could be studied. I had the opportunity of calling a few people that filled in a few details. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time, and I don't have time to do all the research that I deeply desire. But hopefully we're mechabed both of these rabbis, the great Posek, Rabbi Grobart, the great Gaon, Rabbi Price. They're both buried here in Toronto. It's a schus for us. It's a schus to be in a city with such rabbis. And we have to be grateful for the contribution they made, the contribution they both made to the fact that Shabbos is a Shabbos because of them. And teheh, nishmasim should be a schus for their neshama. So we thank you. I'm going to look if there's any comments that I need to address. Stashev or Shul, so Stashev, as mentioned by George, by David, okay, Liz, does it matter that the posts are more than 10 amos apart? So what Josh or Liz are asking is, what if the gap between the posts are more than 10 amos? So there's a dispute. Maimonides, Rambam was of the opinion that it only works. You could only have an Eiruv if the posts are within 10 amos. Most authorities don't follow that. And a Tzuras HaPesach works even if it's more than 10 amos, even if the posts are more than 10 amos apart, and you rely on that. That is something we rely on without a doubt. I think Chabad is more strict with it, and it could be one of the reasons Chabad does not use some of the Eruvin is because they follow the opinion of the Rambam that Tzuras HaPesach only works up until 10 amos. Okay, Rabbosai, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you for the ones who are watching.